an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Goldenhand, chapters 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, and Epilogue. No air to breathe. The battle begins. The river turns back. Wasted fish upon the riverbed. A time to die. And the return of Lyriel. In these chapters, we get to find out exactly what Clore did in order to sort of tether herself to life. And it's honestly such a bummer. I hated it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Yama for commissioning this episode. And also, Yama, don't forget to let me know if, because you had commissioned a few more of this book, but this book is now over. And apparently it's the last in the series, so let me know what you would like to do with the next few episodes, because I could do some of the short stories that are in the Across the Wall, or I could do something else with those. This finale... So it's kind of weird to me, actually. I think it was the third episode of coverage that I was like kind of complaining about how long everything felt like it was taking and that it dragged a little bit. And then it just feels like everything happens at once. And on the one hand, part of me was like really glad to get the resolution and know what happens by the end of this section. But another part of me felt like this was very rushed. And I don't know, maybe that's because I know it's the final book that we've got so far of the series. And so I just wanted it to be a little bit more drawn out, or I wanted there to be more of like maybe like a, I hate to do this because, you know, I think it's well known that I am not a huge fan of the fast forward at the end of Harry Potter, where we get to see like what all happens to everyone. But I think I might have liked at least a sort of like overview of like, over the next so-and-so years, such and such was done. I guess Garth Nix has not necessarily said that he is done writing this series, as far as I know. You guys can fill me in. So maybe he didn't want to do that because he is planning to write another one, and he doesn't feel like, you know, boxing himself into a corner where the next series that he begins feels like it has to start at some distant point in the future. But it just did. It was very quick. And I don't know. I feel like this will happen a lot with the books that he writes, is that there'll be a pretty big lead up of travel and what's the word I want? Quests. And then the final confrontation will kind of be done with fairly quickly. And usually that just hasn't, you know, I've been a little bit surprised by it, but it hasn't exactly bothered me. I think that a part of it too is that in the past, when there's been the final confrontation, it has usually been with somebody that is just, you know, another big bad. But this time it was Clore. And Clore we've gotten to know, you know, when you spend an entire book in the perspective of a certain character, you kind of feel, even if you know that that character turns out to be a baddie, I think that I got a little bit protective of her. And I know that she's like despicable, but when you see what has happened, I felt even more so than I would have, you know, and I really like the fact that Nix decided to include a portion of who she was and not make her an unmitigated villain. Like, that is not to say, because, you know, I tend to be very eye-rolly in reaction to the, like, well, I mean, he was a bad guy, but there's no other way he could have turned out. Look at the way he was raised. Like, there are so many stories out there that try to sort of like low-key justify a person becoming terrible. And I have no patience for that. I really don't. Like, everybody just, you know. So I don't want to say that I need my villains to have another side to them or some sort of tortured backstory. What I really like about Clariel is that she doesn't really have a, quote, tortured backstory. It's not this, like, she had a terrible traumatic thing happen with her family, being attacked and whatnot, sure. And then wanting to, like, go back and save people and ostensibly do the right thing. But it was a very sudden thing. There's not, like, you know, she wasn't abused. There's not the usual kind of, like, oh, bullied terribly and this horrible, like, it was a momentary thing that happened to her that spurred a bunch of really bad decisions that sort of wound up leading her down a path, and the path we don't actually really get to see. And I feel like that seems more accurate to me. I don't like writing trauma and there being this implication that trauma leads you to becoming a bad person. There are so many, like, even things that I have otherwise admired overall, the way something was written or handled. I have run into a few things, Veronica Mars, The Magicians, where somebody who has suffered sexual assault and abuse has turned out to be a bad guy. And I mean, guys, what are we doing here? You know, and it's this thing that, like, what people are trying to do when they write that is be like, sure, they are lashing out and they're angry and a bad person, but it comes from a place of justifiable anger. And I get, like, attempting to do that. But really what you're saying is, like, if somebody gets traumatized, then there's a chance they can't be trusted because they will be so unbalanced by that there's really no coming back from it. What I love about Clariel is that she struggles with wanting to be away from people. She doesn't want to do the things that her family expects of her. But none of that feels like it's inherently going to lead to her doing terrible shit. She has the rage issue, for sure. But I believe if she had been permitted to go to the woods and live the life that she wanted, probably this would have wound up being okay. She wouldn't have descended into things the way that she did. Although her family probably would have still been a target, and then she'd find out about that later and who knows what. But she wouldn't have had access to these creatures. Anyway, the idea to me that there is an incident that starts somebody down a path of making the wrong choices for the right reasons, just that one incident, that feels more true to me. Because the incident made her protective of her, she wanted to get revenge, and she was also, like, horrified at the fact that the entire country seemed to not see what was happening right in front of their faces. So on that point, what she was doing and all the decisions she makes heading in that direction, even as you're reading it, you're like, I understand why you're doing this, but you're being fucking fooled. And that is a real danger when you're dealing, like, you know, obviously in her case, it was these, like, supernatural creatures. But in any case, when you are somebody who has a particular agenda and you have a power of some kind, and, you know, it can be a superpower, it can be what she has with this, like, rage and being able to, like, take control of free magic creatures. It can be connections that you have, or money, or influence, whatever. There are going to be people who try to exploit you for their reasons. And so I rather like that Clariel, she makes bad decisions and definitely, like, gives into her, the worst of her nature. But also, she is being manipulated. And keeps on having to, like, dig further in order to keep this illusion of control, right? So overall, the way that things go bad for Clariel feels to me like a condensed, shortened version of what I imagine does happen to people a lot of the time. You go into a situation genuinely intending to do good a lot, and genuinely like trying to find a way to work within whatever you have been given to make things better. And then you begin to compromise here and there. Just this one time though. I mean, we need to get this thing passed. I'll do this one thing to help you out if you'll deal with this other thing. And all of a sudden you find at the end of like 2 or 3 years that you have compromised everything away and you aren't who you started out. And because of that feeling, like something that is so very possible, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for Clariel and a lot of, it makes me so much sadder to see what happens here. You know what Clariel reminds me of is, and this is a weird thing to say in the current climate, because obviously ACAB, but she makes me think of somebody who joins the police force because they really do want to help and they want to do good and they want to fix things. And maybe they were wronged in some way and they are hoping to prevent that from happening to other people. And they don't realize, as they are trained and influenced by the other people on their team and those who are training them, how they are being shaped and warped to be someone else by the end of it. And her winding up having to literally cut off the part of herself that would not cooperate feels very much like what I have been reading from ex-cops who have been writing a lot of blog entries and articles over the past couple of weeks. If you guys have not read them, there is a particularly long one and it's titled, it was by like an anonymous dude, but it's titled Confessions of a Former Bastard Cop. And he explains the different pieces of training that he experienced that directly lead to the culture of not turning in bad cops, not admitting that somebody used excessive force, planting evidence, doing all of the things that we keep on pretending are just the exception. Those are just the really bad ones. You know, I mean, there's bad apples everywhere. And he makes it a point to be like, that's what we're trained to do. That is not the exception. If you don't do these things, you don't get promoted. You don't get partners that have your back and you're going to be out in situations where your life is in danger and people will let you die because you aren't cooperating with all this other shit that's going on. They will bench you basically and leave you in an office and do everything they can to like make your life hell and get you kicked off the force. They don't want people who don't follow these rules. So what we call bad apples, that is how it's meant to work. It's not a bug. It's a feature. That's the point. And I just really feel that way a little bit about Clariel. It's like, I have more sympathy for her in her situation because what she did is so very personal. You know, obviously, when cops start getting involved in like systemic oppression, I'm really done here. I don't need to feel bad for you. But Clariel, it was her family and it was her like knowing that there were other people sort of at the, what's the word I want? at the mercy of what was the name of the guy? I can't remember. So I just got really, really invested by the time we get to finding Clore in death. And I was a little saddened that it was such a short meeting. I understand that it needed to be, and we can't really build a super effective sense of tension if we don't have this time limit. You know, we have this thing with the oxygen that's happening on the one end, and then inside death, we have Clore actually like coming straight back, so angry. But I wished that, honestly, a part of me wants Lyriel to, I don't think that Lyriel is necessarily like ever really in danger. She seems to know the right thing to do and know her own limitations enough that I don't think she would ever fall into the same sort of trap that Clariel did. But I would have loved for her to find out what really happened here. You know, I just sort of feel like I want Clore's story to be less of a myth, because she is such a larger than life baddie that it makes her feel unrelatable, I'm sure, to the people in Lyriel's time. And I would have loved it if Lyriel found out what led her to becoming who she is, so that the story of this could be handed down and people would understand how like slippery the slope is and how easy it is to wind up doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, allegedly. Obviously, I'm doing the thing that I always do, which is getting ahead of myself. Oh my God. You guys, I can't speak, and that's not a good thing for a podcaster. Let's start. Okay, chapter 35, No Air to Breathe, which starts off with Lyriel saying, I have never slept with a man before. Ma'am. And I expected there to be more of a discussion about this specifically, and it doesn't. It's like just to kind of, Nick just sort of makes a joke about how they still haven't and they can't sleep anyway right now. And then it just moves on. And I was like, come on, talk about it, kids, do it. So they are making their hike to get to the other side of the rift. And it's like, I think a full day. Yeah. It says, it had taken them a day to descend, a day to cross. And now on the third day, they were a good way up the northern side. Yeah. This is a big trip, man. And as they get to the other side, her hand is beginning to be less responsive because she doesn't have the connection to the charter here that she did. And the closer that they get to this like wasteland sort of area, the more tenuous that link becomes until eventually it is absolutely not working at all. And she understandably has a pretty intense panic reaction to that. Now, y'all are going to laugh at me, but bear with me. Lyriel is having the feeling about losing her connection to the charter that we have when we realize we are somewhere with no cell service at all. You get what I'm saying? Everything that you rely on for communication of any kind, and I'm not talking Wi-Fi, I'm saying cell service, like right down to the cell, there's nothing. You can't send a text, you can't make a call, you can't access the internet, you can't do any of the things that you are so used to being able to do at any point at the drop of a hat. And 5 years ago, this comparison might have felt a little bit more comical. But I think today, we have really gotten to a point where we take for granted being able to be in communication with people all day, anytime we feel like it. And I have made the comparison before of the way the charter works, feeling like a huge server that people just sort of like gain access to. And I stand by that. You know, I feel like that is the most accurate description of there. It's like a database that people are linked to. And she is in a spot where the service is not great. And Nick is a hot spot. Nick is somebody who's like somehow got his own, he's like a satellite phone with a little bit of a hot spot that he can generate. And he touches her and is able to reopen the connection enough so that the charter begins to animate her hand well again. And it's not as flawless as it had been, but it's really, really better. Like, it had been about to just completely slow to nothing. And eventually they get to a spot where there is no charter at all. Because her hand is like slowing down and really starting to be like, oh, this is not doing anything. But when she goes to make the spell for the air bubble and there is no response, she has this like sort of visceral panic response. And she has to, before they use the bubble, by the way, she has to go into death really quickly in order to find where the black thread is heading. And I really like that this is the first time that Nick has seen her do this. And like, guys, let's just talk about how much of a fucking champ Nick is. I know I just talk about how much I like Nick all the time, but like, honestly, this dude, she's like, all right, so I'm going to need you to guard my body. I'm going to go into death and there will be ice covering me. Don't worry about it. Please don't touch me because it could kill us depending on what's happening in death. Just be cool and watch me. And what a fucking demand. Like, this guy doesn't have any experience with this shit, guys. Reminder, you know, all of this is new to him as of like 5 days ago. And he's out here fucking connecting to the charter to fuel her hand and doing it again so that she can make this like air bubble spell. This dude is such a goddamn good sport. Good for you, Nick. So she makes this air bubble and they reach Clore's sarcophagus a little bit sooner than I expected. It really doesn't take much searching. But the thing is, it can't because they only have a limited oxygen supply. And it's not even buried, really. It just seems like, you know, if there is wind, it's just been covered with whatever layers of dirt have been blown over it. But nobody has tried to officially bury it. And I'm going to bounce back because on chapter 36, we go back to Samuth and Farron's point of view. And they are looking at all of these, I want to say soldiers, but that feels like generous. All these baddies who are coming and setting up camp next to the river. And we get a sense here of how many of them there are. Like, this doesn't look great for them, even though they have been given some forewarning. It's still really like a close thing. And I love how there's this spelled fog that's coming out and sort of covering their tracks as they begin to like go forward. And Sabriel is like, oh, I don't think so. And she whistles, and it's such a neat, I'm going to read this. She raised her hand, fingers spread wide, and whistled 5 separate notes. With each whistle, charter marks flew from her mouth to cluster on each finger. After the 5th note, Sabriel closed her hand, bringing all the marks together in one glowing ball, which she threw high in the air. Whistling again, the 5 notes joined in an eerie tune. the ball hurtled across the river and disappeared into the great bank of fog that was slowly drifting across the water. Nothing happened. Sam heard Farron let out a deep breath she had obviously been holding in expectation. "What?" Farron began to say, when there was a sudden explosion of light. 5 spears of lightning shot horizontally out of the fog bank like spokes of a massive burning wheel. Cloud wreathed around them. Within seconds, the fog was torn apart, and what lay beneath it was exposed to the light of the great red-tinged moon. That's dope. I'm sorry, but that's just really cool, man. I love this. I love that they're like, oh yeah, we're going to have this fog and nobody's going to know what we're doing. And she's like, bitch, I think not. It's so good. So they're looking at the fact that there are all of these like free magic creatures made out of sand, made out of stone, and they're sort of mystified about what this is. And all I could think was like, they're clearly going to build a bridge out of these guys, dudes. I can't believe that you're not like getting that. Of course, that's what they're doing. And that is indeed what it winds up being. But at this point, they are I think the stone ones are crossing the river and they have this like chain. And I really liked that Samuel says something about breaking that chain because that's got the like spell woven into it. And Sabriel tells him that spell took probably months, perhaps even years to put together. There is no way that we are breaking that spell apart in one shot in one day. Not happening. And it never occurred to me that there would be spells that you need days to take apart. But I guess it makes sense, you know? So Touchstone says, let's see, send a messenger to the camp, everyone to move out now to take up defensive positions on the riverbank, which we find out later is exactly the wrong move because the river is going to be, it's a trap. I mean, it's not it winds up being a trap because of the only way to stop them is to destroy that. But I don't know that was set up to be a trap in the end. It's unclear to me. Like, Clore, I wouldn't imagine that she really, like, values so much her people. So I guess she could have been, yeah, I'll set this up so that we, like, manage to get past, and then I can, like, take out all of these people in one shot and not have to worry about them because they're not needed anymore. I don't know. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Now I'm realizing that as I say this, what is Clore's objective here? She is trying to like gain ground, but is there a specific reason why? Or is it just like a power grab? I find it weird that she would necessarily worry about that. Am I forgetting like a major thing? I feel like I must be. But I'm just realizing I don't actually know what she's after. I know that she was like she was trying to kill all of the girls that were on hold for her to potentially possess. But I don't know about, like, that was so that any links that could potentially wind up hurting her would be gone because they have that like embedded in them, a way to find her sarcophagus and to find her other part of herself in death. So that's not the objective. That is a side quest to get the objective done. So what is it that she's even really after? I don't feel like I know this, and I feel like either I'm foolish for not knowing or forgetting, or that's a really weird oversight. Help me out, guys. All right, so Touchstone and Sabriel are about to head out, and they tell Samuel to stay where he is. He begins to argue, but he's given orders. And Farron, for her part, is like, come on, dude, you're really going to just stay here? We need to go down to the battle. And he says, with the North Castle stripped of troops and only 1/3 of the garrison here, you will likely get plenty of fighting, even if you stay right here with me, said Sam. Ah, said Farron, that is different. You want me to fight at your side? I accept. I love Farron and the way that she, like, words things. And I really like, too, after being in her perspective, like, I feel like it gives a whole different vibe to things because we know that Farron gets scared. We know that she experiences pain, but she always makes herself not show her emotion or react and approach things in the way she was taught. And it's interesting to see the effect of it from the outside without the benefit of knowing that she is actually scared, and realize, like, the impression that she gives to everybody around her. Ayantu's here in the chat. Hi, Ayantu. I don't think we know the details, but this seems to be her long game power play to take control. That's not specific enough. And I'm not mad at you, Ayantu. I'm like mad at the fact that this isn't something I know the answer to, and I really feel like I'm supposed to, or I don't know. That doesn't, like, if she was making a play for power, I would want to know more about what she wants control of at all. Like, what is she intending to do? Reshape everything so that it, like, destroy the whole charter and just have things be ruled by the, you know, honestly, that was kind of the problem with Karagor as well, was like not really knowing what Karagor was after. At least with Uranus, it's destroy everything. That's a very simple, straightforward, terrible thing that I understand him having this, like, impulse to do that because that is what and who he is. And I understand exactly how that's going to be carried out. And that feels more specific. But this is just sort of a general, like, oh, she's coming at us. And I don't really... We don't have a single scene where we even see Clore until she's fighting with Lyriel at the very end. And with Karagor, at least we had like one or two sort of like encounters with a voice sort of telling them a thing, right? I don't know. I want a little bit more in that department. Like, don't get me wrong, Clore is scary. I mean, obviously. And the forces that she has at her disposal right now are very intimidating. And I'm not mad at people for just being afraid of her. That's not the problem. But I would like it if it were a little bit more sketched out exactly what she's after. Anyway, okay. So we go back to Nick and Lyriel with the charter and him managing to access it and bring it back to her. And it takes a minute, but she is like plunged into the charter again, finally, the way that she had been when she would touch somebody's mark at home. And I love this. Being cut off from the charter was almost like not existing herself. And there's no way for her to explain to Nick what that panic is and what it feels like to her, because he hasn't got really a frame of reference for that. So she manages to make this globe of air, and Nick has to maintain contact with it in order to feed it charter magic so that it will stay, in place, because there is a chance that it just flickers and goes out and they are left in essentially a void where they can't breathe and they just die. So he has to stay in contact with it. And eventually the disreputable dog is like, dude, lay on her back and just touch it from like laying down. You don't need to stand here with your arms up like a friggin' weirdo. And I really appreciated that, because when he said his arms ached from standing up, I was like, why doesn't he just sit and like put his arm along the ground? I was like thinking that exact thing. And finally somebody gave him the bright idea. He's a little distracted. You know, his lady's in death. I mean, that's going to probably make it so that you don't think straight. So they head out and they find the sarcophagus, and they manage to uncover it with very little trouble. And she is inside, but it's just like a desiccated corpse, you know? It's like barely even a skeleton. Reminder, she's 900 years old. And Lyriel says her spirit is still attached to it, or rather some fragment of her spirit, a small part that Clore didn't move to the new body. I have to go into death and send the spirit on. And she goes into death, and then we cut back to chapter 37. The river turns back. And this is when Samith begins to realize exactly what the plan is here. Because there is just this weird invisible barrier that seems to pop up. And all of a sudden, the river is like rising on one side, but beginning to really like drop away on the other. And he realizes that there is an invisible dam that is holding a bunch of the water back so that they can cross. And like if the opposition is in the way when that dam breaks, it's going to be a hell of a flood. I find it really interesting how often Garth Nix goes to devastating floods in his stories. I wonder what that is about. Because reminder, with Sabriel, this is one of the very first things that she has to do. She has to sacrifice a bunch of like villages and whatnot by calling on this like water to wash away the dead that are pursuing her, and building a bridge of like, I think graveyard dirt, if I'm not mistaken. It's a pretty brutal scene, this choice that she has to make, to be honest. And this just was extremely reminiscent of that to me. So, yeah, here it is. The river was swirling back from some invisible barrier, and it was growing shallower in front. There must be something we could do. When the river's dry, we'll be able to attack them. We would drown when the river comes back. Perhaps we will drown anyway. Surely no spell can hold such a river forever. Once their army is across, where will all the held back water go? I get her point. I assumed that this was part of their tactic, but it could just be not entirely thought out. After we get across, what do we do? I would think that there are ways to replace the water that don't necessarily result in an enormous flood. Maybe you just, you have this dam and then you open a, what do they call that? Locks? There's like locks on dams, I think. I think that's what they're called. Something like that. And you open portions of it to allow some water through. And I feel like, we could have set it up so that was done a little bit more responsibly, but obviously they don't really care about the well-being of surrounding communities. So what can you say? So let's see. Father told me to hold here, but if the river is released upon us once they get across. He looked at the river again. It was rising fast behind that unseen wall of magic. A strange and terrifying sight. Muddy water climbing into the air, roiling backward, spray flying as it met the barrier. The water was at least 50 paces higher than the normal water line already, and in front the river was draining away already low enough for him to see it had sunk 15 paces or more below the western cutwaters of the bridge. Yeah, this is no bueno. And it really was so rough for me that despite the fact that Lyriel wins the day and manages to send Clore into death, a lot of people still wind up dying due to this. It's still like a pretty terrible tragedy. Let's see. We'll go to the North Castle, said Sam, and then we'll see. But he spoke to empty air. Farron was already hurtling down the steps, her crutches clattering like a drumbeat. I love how much ahead of him Farron is. She's like, dude, what do you think we should do? And then when he stops and is like thinking it over, she's like, you know what? Fuck this. I know what we should do. And I'll just wait for you to fucking catch up, which is essentially exactly what she does. And then we go back to Lyriel. And she finds the spirit right away. She was dressed in what her physical body
hear it in your music.
Siri is just so goddamn nosy. I don't know why she does this. She was dressed in what her physical body had been laid to rest in, a plain white robe similar to the ones worn by the Clare. Her face was cruelly scarred. There was a misshapen, jagged X on her forehead where Lyriel guessed there had once been a charter mark, and raised welts on her cheeks. She would have been pretty once, or perhaps handsome would be a better word, for she had a strong, determined face. The scars were not good to look upon, but even so, for a moment Lyriel wondered why this woman had hidden behind a mask of bronze. But there was no time for curiosity about such details. She braced herself against the current, raised Ramina high, and brought the sword down straight into the scarred woman's chest. But the blade met no resistance, and there's no wound or anything. And Lyriel is like, wait a second, what the fuck? And realizes, like, this fragment of spirit is a very slim fragment, and it's got so little substance that a lot of the shit that she would ordinarily be able to use isn't even going to work in this situation. Lyriel stared down at the suspended figure and tried to work out what to do. So she's looking over her bells and weighing what each of them does and whether or not they will be effective here. She doesn't think Kibith, which is the disreputable dogs, making her walk. She's like, I don't think that this inactive spirit that's so insubstantial can be made to walk. Dairim is... It says, this was no silenced creature that needed a voice, nor one to be stilled. The thinker, to restore the patterns of a living person, to give them back what they once were and return independent thought. What would Belgair do for this remnant spirit? Something deliberately separated from the greater whole. Saraneth, the deepest, lowest bell, to bind the dead to the ringer's will. But again, what could Saraneth do against the suspended spirit? Then there was Asteriel, whose melancholy cry would cast all who heard her deep into death, everyone including the ringer. And this is what she winds up having to use. First, she tries Belgair, and to bring clarity of thought, and the spirit's eyes open. There was fear there, quickly overcome. And a moment later, she burst from the water, coughing and spluttering, and grabbed at Lyriel. Go, said the Abhorsen in waiting. She drew Kibith and rang it, and the woman spun around in answer to the bell's rising, exuberant call. She took 2 steps, 3, but then stopped and turned around. I would if I could, she said, her voice husky and weak. I think, but I can't. I have made sure of that. And I love this, how she's calling her she, and then has to be but it's also kind of me. She lifted the foot out of the river, and Lyriel sees that her ankle is bound with a rope. This is cable. This is not a little piece of fucking thread. And this spirit tells her, I am the part of Clore that would not become what she became when I found free magic again and had to make my choice. And she asks whether or not Belatiel is the Abhorsen. To which, Lyriel, she doesn't tell her, no, he hasn't been the Abhorsen for almost a millennia. But she kind of is that dude's name is only in history books for me. I do not know him. And she says, it seems only yesterday we were exiled, and for years I resisted temptation, did not seek to find new powers. But then, by pure chance, or so I must suppose, I found the bottle. A Zagreseer was within. For a long time I did not open it, thinking myself strong. But I was not. I undid the stopper, and a Zagreseer came forth. We fought, and I thought I compelled it to serve me. I was badly wounded, and like to die. There was a woman, a young woman of the Dnath, who served me. A Zagreseer told us we could take her body to live on. I refused. Despite everything else, I would not do that. Yes, it is true I could not resist the lure of free magic, but I would not steal another's body. Yet I must have done. I see we did, though I am also here. What a weird story. I want to hear much more about this. Like, how is it that this part of her doesn't even remember exactly what happened? And as she's like continuing the story, she's talking about how the other version of herself, or the other part of her, is coming back. And that she is very angry about being disturbed in the middle of her big plan unfolding. Let's see. She has used so many bodies, so many young women. Tears fell like bright crystals following the scars along her cheeks, only to instantly darken as they hit the river, to break and swirl away as if they were in fact drops of blood. And that is really evocative. That is a extremely vivid image in my head. She says she's coming with all of her dead servants. She leaves a great battle. It is the greenwash, though strangely dry. She is furious, enraged that I am awake, that I know myself again. It has come when she is most busy, the battle needing her direction. But now she must come here to snap me up and make us whole again. You must help me go before she comes. I am the lesser part. I will not be able to resist should she draw close. And Lyriel is trying to figure out how she can undo this cable. And the more she looks at it, she's just like, I have no fucking idea how this was even made. Like, I don't know what to do here. So eventually she draws Asteriel. And then we go back to the greenwash, and everything is really like ramping up now. Dozens of Woodweirds had charged the walls only minutes after Sam had let his garrison into the castle. The Woodweirds came not to try and scale the high walls, but to hurl great tubs of stone into the moat. And this is when we see like the sand swimmers that crawl over it and then sort of disperse. They don't try and climb up the walls. They fill in the gaps between the stones like mortar almost. And it says, the sand swimmers became the raw sand and stone of their making, vast quantities of solid material filling the moat for a stretch of 200 paces, so the next assault would come right up to the walls. Sam could see this third wave preparing in the distance, 400 or 500 warriors on foot, out of bowshot, but well within sight under the brilliant moon. So then we have Farron's people, who begin to approach, and they are turning their coats inside out. And it says, so she says, they reverse their coats so we might see who we face and gain honor from the knowledge. There was a flash of white in that line of warriors, and then another. It took Sam a moment to realize what he was looking at. They were turning their coats inside out to show the white fur of the Athask, great cat of the northwestern mountains. And spoiler alert, guys, fucking Mogget shows up here. I'm going to admit it. I feel robbed. We get, 4 paragraphs? And Mogget's gone? Not enough. Not even remotely enough. I want so much more of this. So let's see. Sam is watching. He says, it's too late. What's too late? Asked Mogget. And then we go back to Lyriel. And I was like, what? Oh, you guys, I was so irritated. So Lyriel holds out her golden hand to Clariel, who grips it with both of her own, and then she swings Asteriel up. And as Asteriel rings, they get thrown further on into death. And they go down to, I think, like the 5th gate, finally, because they get thrown through several. And it is still not enough. She tells Clariel to let go of her hand and the river will take her. And she falls back in the river, fully releasing, like, prepared to go. And it doesn't work. And Lyriel's like, oh my God, I'm going to need to go with her all the way to the 9th precinct. And I did not think that this was going to require such a journey, and that's really dangerous. And then we go back to Mogget. And I love this. Farron, like, thinks that she recognizes him. She kneels and says, are you the Athask? Maybe, said Mogget. I can't remember. And when he refuses to help, because Sam is asking him, can you break Clor's dam? He says, none of my business, I was just curious. Farron gets really irritated and says, I knew you couldn't be the Athask. You're too small and too... Mogget blazed brighter than a star, and there was suddenly a huge white cat upon the wall, one 3 times the size of a nomad horse. He put his head back and yowled with tremendous energy outward to the moon and the advancing nomads under it, a caterwaul that reeked of free magic, white sparks spraying out for tens of paces, accompanied by great gouts of white smoke and an almost overwhelming stench of hot metal. Then he lowered his face to yowl more softly at Farron, who covered her face with one arm, fell off her crutches, and would have gone backward off the wall to certain death if Sam hadn't flung himself forward and caught her. And Sam is just like, you know what? Fuck you. You're just going to come here and cause trouble and not help? And Mogget's like, come on, I did help you. I mean, it wasn't a big thing, but it's better than nothing. The rest is going to be up to you. And he leaps over the wall and disappears. And I'm just like, come on, Mogget, what are you even doing? I just really want to know what's up with him. What is this? And they look down, and all of the Athask have stopped dead and are turning their coats back right side out again and running away. And Farron says, obviously, the Athask, because that's what she's calling Mogget, has given us his protection, and the clan realizes that he is not pleased with what they were doing here. So that is why they have decided to distance themselves from this whole thing. And that is a pretty, like, what a weird, I don't know. This was like one of those moments where I'm like, I like it, but honestly, what's happening here at the Greenwash is like so much less interesting to me than what's going on with Lyriel, that I feel like you had to bring Mogget into the mix in order for this to seem interesting enough that when we leave Lyriel's POV, I'm not just going, ugh, and it doesn't last long enough. So then we go back to just them sort of watching and waiting. And that's not hugely interesting. And once we do have like the descent of the water and everybody being washed away, it's described in this like very detached way and not apparently from anybody in particular's point of view. And we'll get there once I read it. That again, once I realized that was how things were going to go down and that was like going to be the end, I was sort of surprised that was how this author decided to like leave it. So we go to Nick's point of view. He is watching Lyriel's body and starting to get very worried because time is really starting to like run out here. And all of a sudden, the disreputable dog pops up and she has like, come out of Lyriel's pocket because she was in there as the statue. You will need to put more of yourself into the globe and breathe less. Lyriel has to ring Asteriel, lie down with her hands out to keep contact with the globe. And can you help her? Asked Nick, fighting the panic he suddenly felt. No, the dog said sadly, but you can if she makes it back. She went on point, nose forward, legs up, and then was gone, an intensely cold breeze rushing over Nick from where she had been. In her place, the little soapstone statuette balanced on two legs for a moment, then fell over. I really kind of enjoyed this, that like between her and Mogget, they both can only do like very minimal, like, you know, they can't, they're not exactly a deus ex machina coming in to solve the whole problem. They're just coming by to be like, oh my God, do it this way. Fuck. And then they leave. So we go to Lyriel and Clariel's, you know, piece of her spirit tumbling through the gates, finally reaching the 9th precinct. And Lyriel, it's reminder, the 9th precinct is the one that has the sky full of stars. That is very sort of entrancing and causes you to want to go upwards toward it. And Clariel is looking up and says thank you to Lyriel. And this is when the rest of Clore appears. And they have a big fight. And this, like, Clore winds up getting distracted enough when she begins to fight against herself that she looks up and sees the stars. I love the way this goes. A small, scarred woman, her arms outstretched, stepped in front of her greater self, standing between the huge creature of shadow and Lyriel. Come, said Clariel. Clore slowly lowered her sword, and the red flames that licked along the blade went out. It was a reluctant movement, as if the greater dead answered to some unseen force. But the sword did not stay down. Clore made a noise, a dry, clattering chuckle. She lifted the sword again and swung it back, clearly intending to sweep away the annoying remnant of her past, the tiny fragment of lost humanity who had so long served to keep her from the final death. But in swinging back, Clore looked up and was caught by the stars. In that same moment, Clariel stepped forward and closed her arms around the shadow stuff of Clore, resting her head against the fires that burned and flickered over the creature's chest. Clariel's eyes were open, clear-sighted, knowing what she did. This path I choose, whispered Clariel. She spoke very low, but Lyriel heard her clearly. Her voice was strangely like a bell. And I was like, what does that mean? What is that? What's going on there? Clore's sword fell and was lost in the river. She seemed suddenly smaller, diminished, and lost. Greater dead and remnant spirit rose to the sky together. Starlight wreathed them both, quenching the fires, stripping back the shadows, smoothing the scars away. Shadow and fire joined with shining spirit to become one again. A young woman who until the very end chose neither wisely nor well, and who had existed for centuries, but had died long ago. I really liked this, guys. This made me sad. I don't know. I like this a lot. And Lyriel almost gives in as well, because in watching them ascend, she sees the stars and begins to be sort of lured in by them and has to remember that Nick is waiting for her. And the dog shows up and Lyriel is like so ecstatic and crying. And we find out later that the dog tells her that she's going to come to their wedding. And I really liked this. It was very sweet. So then we have the epilogue. If the appearance of their tribal fetish and Mogget's expression of displeasure to the Athask was the first turning point, the absence of Clore was the second. She had gathered all the war leaders of the clans together. And this is what's weird to me. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that this feels rushed. They defeat Clore, and then everything that occurs after that is in the epilogue, which I find just not quite adequate. And we get this, like, sort of, the disagreements became arguments, the arguments duels, and the fighting, like, it's all told in a way as if you are hearing about it or reading about it in, like, a history book rather than seeing it from somebody's perspective. And so we find out that eventually things just sort of, like, fall apart because they don't have a leader. And we go back into, like, a dialogue between Sam and Farron, but it's not like they aren't the ones seeing what's happening out there, you know? It's just the way this is done is really weird. And then, like, when we have the wave of water, it says, there would be mourning in Navis and Sindel and most of all in Belissaire, for almost the entire trained band of the Guild of Vintners was closest to the river, and they were all drowned or swept away. Sabriel and Touchstone survived, though both were wounded. So all of that feels really detached, third person, in a way these books never really feel to me. And then right after, though both were wounded, then it goes directly into the next sentence. They rested on their swords for a moment and looked at each other. They had survived many battles, some even more dire than this. It's like the way it's written, it's like this distant, like, oh, they survived, as if we're looking back on it from a week in the future. But then we immediately go to, they rested on their swords for a moment and looked at each other, as if we're talking about the present right now. It's extremely strange. I don't understand why it was written this way. It doesn't feel like anything in any of the other books to me. And I'm surprised that an editor didn't notice how jarring this is back and forth and this perspective is. It just, I don't know. I did not care for this wrap up. I don't understand what he was really trying to do here. And we have, like, this hint here about, Farron and Sam getting together and her wanting this, like, you know, him to make her a foot and being really particular about how she wants it. And then at one point she leans over and she puts her tongue in his ear and he's like, "What is that?" And she says, "It is our custom after a battle, the beginning of a custom anyway. There is more, I will show you. We have lived, and now we must be joyful." And all of a sudden, he's like getting it, and he says, "Oh, God, I guess I'm a bit slow." And she says, "Yes, you are. But it is of no matter, I am not." And that is the end of the book. What a weird ending, guys. I don't know what to make of that. Like, is that just me? I'm out of time here, so I'm going to wrap, but I really, really want to know what you all think. So let me know. Thank you, Yama, for commissioning this again. Let me know what you want me to do with the next episodes. And I hope that you guys enjoyed the coverage. And I'll be seeing you when I see you. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.